you think of like British history, like knights and castles kind of come to mind, right?
Mm-mm.
But like if you rewind the clock way back, even before then.
Centuries.
Centuries, yeah. So you sent us a ton of material here, like ancient timelines. I don't even know if those were written down. Maybe they're etched into stone or something. And then you've got like chronicles of, kings and stuff.
It is a pretty big sweep of time.
Yeah, yeah. So this deep dive, like we're really going to try to figure out, like what were the big changes that shaped the land, right? Like starting from the Iron Age and going, we're going to go all the way up to like the Normans.
Yeah, and I think what's cool about what you sent is it really kind of shows how you can't really look at those periods in isolation. They really build on top of each other.
Right, yeah, yeah.
And our goal today is to really kind of like pull out like what were those big shifts, right? Those aha moments that will help you understand how Britain became Britain. And we'll be talking about a whole bunch of stuff, cultural changes, invasions, like different powers kind of coming and going.
Right, okay. So let's like dive in. And the first period, it's not probably the first thing you think about when you think of British history, but the British Iron Age.
Okay.
We're talking 800 BC to 100 AD, so this is even before like the big Roman thing.
Right.
And so the people who were living there then, they were Celtic Britons speaking a language from the Brythonic family. That sound, pretty like self-contained world at this point.
Yeah, well, it would seem so, right? But what's really interesting is even then, it wasn't like totally isolated. Like the classical world knew it was there, mostly because they wanted tin.
Oh, right.
The name Britain might even come from the word, the Phoenician word Barathanac, which means land of tin.
Yeah.
So you've got these like international trade connections way before the Romans.
And you have people like Pytheas. He was a Greek guy, and he sailed up there in like the 4th century BC. And maybe even a Carthaginian, Himilco, might have even gone up there even earlier. So this was like, this kind of like mysterious land at the edge of what they knew.
The edge of the world, wow.
Yeah.
And, we're talking about, like there seem to be big economic distinctions within the island itself, too. Like the material that we're looking at, it talks about like lowland southeast versus the highland north and west.
Right. And so what you see in the southeast, because it's more fertile land, it's easier to farm. They're doing more arable farming there.
Yeah.
And we even see like trackways, which is like, that's an early form of road.
Yeah.
Like the Icknield Way. And these are really important for connecting people and moving goods and all that stuff.
Right.
But then if you go up north, it's more rugged. Right. So what do they do up there?
I guess they don't do as much farming.
Yeah, it's more pastoralism, which means they're raising animals.
Sheep, that kind of thing. And so they're living in smaller, more dispersed settlements. And it's harder to communicate, when you're up in those hills. And so you see that they tend to have these more defensible settlements.
Right. Okay. So like they're a little more protected.
Exactly.
And even in the South,
yeah.
Which seems like it was a little bit more settled, things weren't totally static, right? Like the material mentions these things called oppida starting to crop up. Like, what is that all about?
So the oppida, these are like larger settlements. And what's interesting is a lot of times they weren't heavily fortified, at least not early on. So it seems like the Southeast is there's this growing importance of trade.
Oh, okay.
And it could be a sign that they're moving away from like just purely kinship-based, like tribal structures. And it could even be like an early form of some kind of proto-political organization.
Right.
Also, there's this increase in commercial contact with the European continent, especially after the Romans conquer Transalpine Gaul, which is like modern-day France.
Yeah.
So that opens up all these new trade routes. And you even get stuff like Italian wine coming into places like Hengistbury Head.
Wow. So it's starting to sound a little bit less isolated.
Exactly. It's a lot more dynamic than you might think.
Yeah. Wow. And then we get the arrival of like the Belgi.
Yeah.
And, Caesar mentions them, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't sound like they were just like coming over for tea.
No, not at all. So Caesar's accounts, if you put those together with the archaeology, we're finding coins. And it seems like these Belgi guys, they came from northeastern Gaul, and they were initially doing raids.
Oh, right.
But over time, they start to settle down, and they really like the southeastern coast.
Okay.
And the earliest coins we find are from before 100 BC.
Wow.
Some, maybe even as early as 150 BC. And these are, like, initially they're all in Kent.
Right.
And then later they start minting their own coins in Britain, and they spread along the south coast. But they really like the southeast, but their influence probably went further inland. And they'd have these Belgic chieftains who would kind of take over politically the existing British groups.
So they're kind of like setting themselves up.
Exactly. And Caesar even mentions this Belgic king, Diviciacus of the Suessians. And he apparently had power in parts of Britain before Caesar even showed up.
Okay, so like the Romans are coming, right? Julius Caesar, the big name.
Right.
What was he doing in Britain? Was it just like a quick trip to see what was going on?
Well, he went on 2 expeditions in 55 and 54 BC. And he wrote all about it in his Gallic Wars, which is like his big book.
Yeah, his memoir, basically.
Yeah. So he was probably doing some reconnaissance,
Checking it out.
Yeah, finding out about the island, the people. But he also definitely wanted to show everyone that Rome was powerful,
Like flex on them a little bit.
Exactly. So the first invasion in 55 BC, that was late in the summer, and he didn't really do that much, just establish a little beachhead in Kent. But the second one, that was a bigger deal. He made some alliances with local leaders. He put this guy, Mandubracius, as a friendly king.
Right.
And he got this British warlord, Cassivellaunus, to submit.
Wow. But so he wasn't like fully conquering it at this point, right?
Yeah.
Like he wasn't setting up shop and staying there?
No, not the classic, like, I came, I saw, I conquered.
Right.
He didn't establish Roman rule. He didn't hold on to any territory. What he did was he made them promise tribute.
Oh, interesting.
And he took hostages to make sure they behaved. And then he left.
He left. Wow.
Yeah, and that arrangement, this kind of like informal, you pay us tribute, you're our client state thing, that basically went on for almost 100 years, all the way to the 40s AD.
Wow, so they milked that for all it was worth.
They did. And even Augustus, Caesar's successor.
Right.
He thought about invading a bunch of times.
Right.
But he never did. Maybe because there were other problems going on in the empire.
Yeah. You got to prioritize.
Exactly. Or maybe he thought, hey, the trade's going well, these British leaders are playing ball, maybe it's not worth the hassle.
Yep.
So yeah, it was more about economics and influence than like boots on the ground.
I was reading that it's like the customs duties were actually making Rome more money than if they had gone in and conquered it.
Yeah.
Like the taxes they would have gotten wouldn't have been as much.
Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of like cost-benefit analysis of empire.
Yeah, they were getting, I guess they were fine with just being friends, kind of.
Exactly. It's like 100 years of just, getting to know each other.
But during all this time, things are still changing within the island, right?
Oh, absolutely. By the 40s AD, it's not the same Britain that Caesar saw.
Right.
The power dynamics have totally shifted.
So who's the big guy now?
Well, you've got this tribe, the Catuvlani. They're the big dogs in the southeast.
Okay.
They basically pushed out the Trinovantes and are even putting pressure on the Atrebates.
Who are the Atrebates?
Funny enough, they're descendants of Commius, who was one of Caesar's buddies.
Oh, wow.
So it's like a whole new game.
So all this is happening, and then we get to AD 43.
Right.
Which is like the classic start date for Roman Britain.
Mm-hmm.
So Claudius, the emperor, he decides, okay, it's time to make this official.
Yeah, he and his general Aulus Claudius, they're the ones who really kick off the Roman conquest. But we got to remember, this wasn't like a bolt from the blue.
Right.
There's been 100 years of Roman influence.
Right. Trade, diplomacy.
Exactly. The Romans weren't walking into some totally unknown land.
Right. They've done their homework.
They had. So Roman Britain, or Britannia as they called it, it becomes a big part of the Roman Empire for centuries, right? But they didn't control the whole island, did they?
No, I don't think they did.
So Britannia, it was basically the island south of the border with Caledonia, which is, modern Scotland.
Right.
And they ran it like a proper Roman province. They improved agriculture, they built towns and cities, they had their fancy Roman architecture.
Aqueducts and stuff.
Exactly. Industries grew, they imposed Roman law and administration. But it's funny, we don't have that many detailed accounts of Britannia written by Roman historians after the first few decades.
Oh, really?
So archaeology is super important for understanding what was going on.
So they were more about doing stuff than writing about it.
It seems that way.
And speaking of doing stuff, those northern borders with Hadrian's Wall and then later the Antonine Wall, those really show where Roman power stopped.
They do. Hadrian's Wall, that's the big one, built around 128 AD. The Antonine Wall, that's further north. And that was a later attempt to push Roman control further into what's now southern Scotland. But it didn't last.
Right.
So these walls, they show how fluid and contested that frontier was. The Romans never totally conquered Caledonia, and later on, they even split Britannia into two provinces, Britannia Superior and Britannia Inferior.
It was too much to handle.
It was a lot to manage, and then even later, they divided it even further into a diocese. So it's kind of like if you have this big company, and you break it up into smaller divisions to manage it better.
Right, regional headquarters.
Exactly.
But like all empires, Roman rule, it eventually ends, right? It's not like one day the lights went out, though, was it? It was more of a slow fade.
Exactly. It was a long process. Different regions experienced it differently. But a big turning point was this thing called the Crisis of the 3rd century. That's from 235 to 284 AD. And it messed up the whole Roman Empire, not just Britain.
It happened.
You have civil wars, plagues, the economy goes down the drain. And that makes it really hard for the empire to keep control of its provinces.
Right, especially the ones far away.
Exactly. And for a while, the empire actually splits up, and Britain becomes part of this breakaway state called the Gallic Empire.
Wow, so they're on their own.
Yeah, they are. And then in the early 5th century, things get even worse.
Right.
Roman troops are pulled out. Stilicho takes some in 402 AD.
So it's like they're starting to abandon ship.
They are. And then Constantine III takes the rest of the legions in 407 AD. And around this time, they also stop sending the regular payments of coinage to Britain.
Oh, so they're cutting them off financially, too.
Exactly. And there's this famous letter from Emperor Honorius around 410 AD, where he basically tells the cities in Britain, you're on your own.
Wow.
But even after the Roman troops and administrators leave, Roman culture doesn't just vanish overnight. This period after the Romans leave, it's called sub-Roman Britain.
Okay.
And the people there, they probably still saw themselves as Roman, even without the empire directly ruling them.
They're still holding on to that identity.
They are. But with Roman power gone, things start to change. The Germanic raiders who had been coming to Britain, well, they start to see it not just as a place to loot, but as a place to settle.
Right.
And there's probably a lot of infighting and power struggles going on within Britain at the same time.
So it's kind of a free-for-all.
In a way, it is. And then you get the Anglo-Saxons.
Right, a whole new group of people coming in.
Exactly. So the Anglo-Saxon settlement, this was a big deal.
Yeah.
You have all these Germanic peoples coming over from continental Europe, the Angles, Saxons, Frisians, Jutes, a whole bunch of them.
Right.
And this happens over a few centuries after the Romans are gone. And it wasn't like one big invasion. It was a more gradual process, migration, settlement, setting up new kingdoms.
It was like a slow-motion invasion?
Yeah, in a way it was. And this wasn't just a change in leadership. This was like a whole cultural replacement in much of what becomes England.
Wow.
The Anglo-Saxons, they basically replaced the Romano-British and Celtic culture and languages.
So they brought their own everything.
They did. And this is when you see the emergence of Anglo-Saxon England. And Old English starts to develop. Traditionally, we talk about the Heptarchy, which are the 7 main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.
7 kingdoms.
Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. And traditionally, Kent is seen as the first one, established in the 6th century.
So they're kind of dividing up the land.
They are, but some of the Romano-British people, they actually left Britain and went to mainland Europe. Some went to Armorica, which became Brittany,
Right.
and some went to parts of what's now Spain, Galicia.
So they're spreading out.
They are, and out of all these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, one of them eventually becomes the top dog.
Wessex.
Wessex, exactly. But it was a long and bumpy road to get there.
It wasn't like an overnight success story.
No, not at all. So the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it says that Wessex was founded by these guys, Cerdic and Cynric, in the late 5th or early 6th century.
Okay.
And they supposedly landed in Hampshire. And they gradually took over more land by fighting the native Britons. What's interesting is it seems like the center of their kingdom was initially further north, and then it shifted south and west as they got more powerful.
So they're moving around.
They are. And
Yeah.
like the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Wessex eventually becomes Christian.
Right. That must have been a huge change.
It was a major shift, culturally and socially. And it was a gradual process for all the kingdoms, influenced by both Celtic Christian traditions from the north and west, and the Roman Church pushing in from the southeast.
Okay.
For Wessex, a big moment is when King Cynegold gets baptized in the late 630s AD by this guy, Birinus, who becomes the first bishop of the West Saxons. But becoming Christian, it wasn't like everyone just flipped a switch.
Right.
Cynegold's successor, he actually went back to paganism for a bit before he converted.
Oh, wow.
And there's this interesting political angle. Cynegils converting, it might have been part of a strategy to team up with Northumbria against their rival Mercia.
Mercia. It seems like they were always causing trouble for Wessex.
Yeah, they were a big problem. Mercia was strong in the Midlands, and they kept pushing on Wessex's borders. Wessex even lost control of lands north of the Thames and the Avon.
So they were getting squeezed.
They were, and that forced them to focus on expanding south instead. There was even this time when King Cenwalh of Wessex married the daughter of Penda, the king of Mercia. But then he dumped her.
Oh, no.
And that, of course, led to a Mercian invasion.
Right, you could just dump the king's daughter.
Cenwalh even had to go into exile for a while.
So Mercia is really causing them problems.
They are, but then things start to change for Wessex when Egbert comes to power in the early 9th century. He's a really important figure in Wessex's rise to power.
Okay.
So Egbert takes over in 802 AD, and it's a turning point. He goes after the remaining British kingdoms in the west,
Right.
and he basically brings Devon and Cornwall under West Saxon control. And even more importantly, he defeats Mercia at the Battle of Ellendun in 825 or 826 AD.
Big win.
Huge win. And that gives Wessex control of a lot of southeastern England. For a little while, Egbert even becomes Bretwalda.
Bretwalda, what's that?
It's kind of like being an overlord or a high king among the Anglo-Saxons.
He's top dog.
Yeah, but historians still argue about how much power the Bretwalda really had.
Right.
And Mercia does become independent again later. But Wessex keeps the land they gained in the southeast, so they're getting stronger.
They are. But just when things seem to be going well, they have a new problem.
Vikings.
Vikings, right? Everyone's favorite.
So towards the end of Egbert's reign, you start to see these Danish Viking raids along the coasts of Wessex.
Right.
And they just get worse and worse under his successors. And in 851 AD, this big Danish army lands in the Thames estuary. They even go inland and invade Wessex.
Bold move.
But they get crushed by Egbert's son, Aethelwulf, at the Battle of Aclea.
So they get pushed back.
They do, but the Vikings don't go away. They keep raiding.
Of course.
And then in 865 AD, you get the Great Heathen Army.
That sounds terrifying.
It was a game changer. This was a massive, organized Danish army, and they just rolled over Northumbria and East Anglia.
So they're conquering everything.
And in 871 AD, they invade Wessex.
There we go.
There's some fighting, and King Athelred and his brother Alfred win some battles, but the Vikings keep coming. They get reinforcements, so eventually Alfred has to pay them to go away.
Oh, so they bribe them.
It was a strategic retreat. The Danes then go after Mercia, but they're not done with Wessex.
Not by a long shot.
In 876 AD, they come back, and there are more battles. And this is where Alfred really becomes Alfred the Great.
Right. Everyone knows the story of Alfred and the Vikings.
It's legendary. So the Vikings do this sneak attack in the winter of 878 AD, and Alfred has to hide out in the Somerset levels.
What are those?
It's this marshy area.
Okay.
Not a fun place to be in the winter.
Right.
But Alfred, he pulls himself together, raises a new army, and then he just smashes the Danes at the Battle of Edington.
Big victory.
Huge. And the Danes, they finally leave Wessex for good and go settle in East Anglia. But Alfred, he's not just a great warrior.
Right. He's known for other things, too.
He's a smart guy. He realizes that Wessex needs to be better prepared.
Right.
So he totally reorganizes their defenses.
Okay.
He builds warships. He creates this network of fortified settlements called burhs.
So they're ready for round two.
Exactly. He also reforms the army, so it's not just the same guys fighting all the time.
He's making them sustainable.
Exactly. And all this pays off because in the 890s AD, another huge Viking army invades.
They don't give up.
But Alfred's ready for them, he crushes them, and Wessex barely loses any men.
So he's a military genius.
He's pretty good. But he's not just a fighter. He's also really into learning and culture.
Right.
He knows that Wessex needs a strong intellectual foundation. So he brings in scholars from all over Britain and even mainland Europe.
He's creating like a brain trust.
Yeah, he wants the best minds. And he even translates Latin texts into Old English himself.
Wow.
And he oversees the creation of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is this super valuable historical record.
Right.
And because of his efforts and because Wessex becomes the most powerful kingdom, the West Saxon dialect becomes the standard written form of Old English.
Okay.
He also creates a new law code, so he's really trying to make Wessex a just and well-run society.
So he's a reformer.
He is. And so Wessex, they go from being under constant threat from the Vikings to actually unifying England. How does that happen?
Yeah. How did they go from almost getting wiped out to ruling the whole thing?
Well, the Vikings, they pretty much destroy Northumbria and East Anglia.
Yeah.
And Mercia, they're weakened and divided. So that leaves Wessex under Alfred as the strongest Anglo-Saxon kingdom.
Right.
And Alfred's son, Edward the Elder, and his grandson, Athelstan, they keep going with his plan.
Oh.
They go after the Viking territories in England. And by 918 AD, Edward controls everything south of the Humber River.
So almost all of England.
Almost. And then Athelstan conquers Northumbria in 927 AD. And that's the first time all of England is under one ruler.
Wow.
Wessex basically becomes England.
So that brings us up to 1066.
The Norman Conquest.
Another big turning point.
Absolutely. This one changes everything.
So we have William, Duke of Normandy. He says he should be king of England because he's related to Edward the Confessor.
Right. Edward didn't have any kids.
And maybe he said William should be king. But when Edward dies in January 1066, Harold Godwinson, this powerful English nobleman, he takes the crown.
And that sets off a chain reaction.
Right, because William's not happy.
And neither is Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway.
He also thinks he should be king.
It's a mess. So Harold has a rough year.
That's an understatement.
He has to fight off one invasion in the north and then race down south to deal with William.
Two fronts.
So Harold Hardrada invades in September 1066.
Okay.
And he wins a battle near York. But Harold Godwinson marches his army north and just destroys Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Hardrada's killed, the Vikings are defeated.
While that's happening.
William's already landed in the south.
Oh, no.
And just a few weeks later, on October 14th, Harold's army, they're exhausted from marching all over the country. They face William's Norman and French troops at the Battle of Hastings.
The big one.
Harold's killed, the English army is defeated, and William, he becomes William the Conqueror.
And he gets crowned King of England on Christmas Day, 1066. But it's not smooth sailing from there, is it?
No, not at all. He wins the big battle, but he still has to secure his power.
Right.
For years after Hastings, there are rebellions all over England. It takes until after 1072 for him to really be in control.
So he's got his work cut out for him.
He does. And to make sure everyone knows who's boss, he takes away all the land from the English nobles and gives it to his Norman buddies.
That'll do it.
And the Domesday Book, this big survey that William orders, it shows just how massive this land grab was. By 1086, only a tiny bit of land, mostly up north, is still in English hands.
So he completely reshapes the power structure.
Completely. And it's not just land. The Normans take over all the important positions in the government and the church.
Right.
By the end of the 11th century, there are 0 English bishops.
Wow.
And English abbots, they become super rare, especially in the big, powerful monasteries.
So the English elite is basically gone.
Replaced by Normans. And this has a massive impact on English society and culture.
And some English people just decide to leave.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of Anglo-Saxons, even nobles, they head for the exits.
Where do they go?
Some go to Scotland, Ireland, Scandinavia. Some even go all the way to the Byzantine Empire.
Wow.
A bunch of them join the Varangian Guard, the Byzantine emperor's personal bodyguard.
So they're fighting for someone else?
They are. Some even get settled on the Byzantine frontier and start new communities there.
So the Norman Conquest has ripple effects all over Europe.
It does. It's a huge deal. And there's another interesting aspect. The sources talk about how the Norman Conquest might have changed the rights of women in England.
Oh, how so?
Well, Anglo-Saxon society before the conquest, it did give women some legal and property rights.
Right.
But after the Danish invasions, and especially after the Normans come in, things start to change. It's possible that women lose some of their traditional rights, like the right to consent to marriage.
Okay.
Widows might also have had their rights changed when it came to remarriage and property.
So they're losing some power.
It seems that way. But it's important to remember that how much things changed probably depended on your social status and how much land you owned.
Right.
And the Norman legal system, it's different from the Anglo-Saxon one. And that also influences the legal standing of women over time.
So it's a complicated picture.
It is. Now, when it comes to government, the Normans, they were a new ruling class. But it seems like they actually kept a lot of the Anglo-Saxon systems in place.
Yeah, they didn't just throw everything out.
No, they were actually pretty smart about it. The Anglo-Saxon government was surprisingly organized. They had shires, sheriffs, a treasury, taxes, coinage. They even used writs, which were like official documents.
So they had a system.
They did. And the Normans, they liked that system. They kept the framework. They just replaced the people running it.
Right. New management, same structure.
Exactly. But they did change the language of official documents to Latin.
Okay.
And they introduced some new things, like forest laws, which were very unpopular.
Yeah, I bet.
And the Doomsday Survey, which was this incredibly detailed record of who owned what land and what resources were there.
So they were good at administration.
They were. So yeah, the people at the top changed, but the basic administrative structure stayed pretty Anglo-Saxon.
That's fascinating. And of course, we can't forget about the language. The Norman Conquest had a huge impact on English.
Yeah, it changed the language forever. So the Normans, they spoke Anglo-Norman, which was a dialect of Old French.
Right.
And that became the language of the court, the government, the aristocracy, everyone important.
Fancy people speak French.
Basically.
Yeah.
And that's why English has so many French words.
Right.
A lot of them became part of everyday speech. And French names became more popular too. But it's interesting, compared to earlier invasions, the place names in England stayed pretty much the same.
Huh. I guess the Normans liked the names.
It seems that way. And we don't know for sure how many people were bilingual, but probably a lot of people had to speak both English and French, especially for trade and dealing with the Norman rulers.
So it's like a linguistic melting pot.
It is. And at the lower levels of society, things changed more gradually. The sources even mention that slavery disappears in England by the mid-12th century.
Wow, that's a big change.
It is. But there's no law that officially abolished it.
Really?
It seems like it just kind of faded away.
Okay.
Historians think it was probably a combination of things. The church, they weren't big fans of slavery, especially enslaving Christians.
Right.
And maybe the economy?